Hey all, this is David Ducker coming back at you. This is going to be a video response to Robert Fremantle's video titled Fantasy Fatigue. Excuse me. He was discussing how he doesn't like to play in multiple campaigns at the same time, which are of the same genre. I think his particular example was his local gaming scene had like one game of Dragon Age and one game of Warhammer Fantasy and then one game of Pathfinder, and they're all featuring elves, dwarfs, orcs, and kind of a medieval European style. The geography was similar with mountains and forests and plains, and he was sick of it. He didn't want to be in such similar settings at the same time. And his other group mates were telling him like he was being ridiculous because fantasy is so great and European fantasy is so much the peak of it, and the Tolkien-esque style is just the hot joint to get hooked up with. Now, Robert seemed, he's recording the video like Call of Cthulhu style, like he's going mad as they argue against his own sanity, and he's starting to cave in, and he's starting to go mad and embrace the madness, and he's leaving this apocalyptic log so that we can find it and reconstruct why he ended up in an asylum in Arkham. So Robert, I needed to do a video response to let you know that you are not alone. You are not a madman. For I too have felt the horrible pains of fantasy fatigue. If it weren't so great to have it alliterate like that, I might call it elf fatigue, because I'm sick of elves. And I've had the same problem in my local scene where people want to run Pathfinder. And then that's fine. And then when they're done that, they're like, let's do another game of Pathfinder. And I'm like, we just ran Pathfinder. Like, okay, like if you do run Pathfinder, what about Greco-Roman style with some satyrs and minotaurs? What about just bring in the elemental races and get some Oreads and Undines? What about run it Egyptian style with Arabic elves and Egyptian dwarfs? What about if you run it feudal Japan style and get samurais and ninjas and just cut out the other races? What about if you bring in Mesoamerican style and do everyone's a lizard man and the various tribes of lizard men are competing against each other in the name of their city-states and their state gods, and they all have Cherbuttles and Mahuatls and obsidian swords and step pyramids and Quetzalcoatl style feathered serpents flying around, and that's the whole campaign. But they're all just like, oh no, generic European fantasy, elves and dwarves, and I was like, it burns my brain. So I totally agree that you need to take a break, try something new, try something different. And even if you want to move beyond that, you can bring in Age of Sail, Musketeers, Pirates of the Caribbean style game. You can run in Call of Cthulhu, Industrial Revolution game, a Wild West style game. You could bring in World War II. You could bring in the Vietnam War. We ran a great Call of Cthulhu game in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. You could bring in superheroes as a different genre, and superheroes have all their own subgenres. So you could have Mystery Men style game, or you could have X-Men, or power it up to Avengers, or then Justice League, and have all the different power levels. What about Independence Day or War of the Worlds style role-playing game? What about a zombie apocalypse game? What about Vampire the Masquerade? Or Hunter the Reckoning, kind of a modern take on like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Men in Black. You could play Men in Black all day long. Hellboy, just mix and mash all of these together. And then you could even go even further and say, what about the future? What about the post-apocalyptic wastes of Fallout, of Mad Max, of Waterworld. Let's do that game. Or if you don't think the world is going to be destroyed, you could hit up space opera, Star Trek, Warhammer 40,000, which can get a little silly at times. Star Wars, Mass Effect. You could play that as a great role-playing game. Firefly, Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5. You know, so many great detailed alien races. There's just so many things you could do to narrow your focus down not only to one genre, but to one style of the genre, where it's all Tolkien all the time. It really boggles my mind that people would do that. You know, it's kind of like how comic books, people see comic books and they say, oh, that's only for superheroes. Where was that written? Because comic books have had so many different genres represented. I can remember being a kid and reading the Star Trek comic books and loving it. You know, G.I. Joe, Transformers, they're not quite superheroes, great comic books. You can bring in something like From Hell, gothic horror comic book, The Walking Dead, Y, The Last Man. Yeah, you can bring in so much. Of course, in the 50s, Western comics, detective comics, romance comics, funny animal comics, bring some humor into it. So again, comic books, you can do anything with comic books. It's just a way of telling a story. It's not constrained to a story itself. And it's the same thing with role-playing games. They're a way of telling a story. What that story is entirely up to you. So a lot of games will be action and or adventure style, but you don't need to have any combat at all. You could just run a soap opera. You know, just like legit, just people getting dramatic at each other and acting it out. Or you could run a race, you know, whether it's a horse race, a car race, motorcycle race, a spaceship race, an airplane race. Just the need for speed coming in there and competing without violence can be so great. Or a sports-based RPG, whether it's you know, fantasy football, the RPG, or baseball, or pro wrestling, or whatever you want. So the horizons for role-playing games are virtually unlimited. And when you intentionally limit and straitjacket yourself and narrow your focus down into one small niche, I just don't understand it either. It's depriving yourself of a world of possibility. And within that niche as well, Robert talked about how people sometimes even restrict themselves to one system, where they're like, oh, I not only do I only play Tolkien-esque high fantasy, but I'll only use Pathfinder to do it. So you've now restricted yourself to just one rule set. And while I don't mind Pathfinder, there's so many other possibilities it cannot encompass. You know, just by the constraints, especially the magic system and the religious system with the priests in that game, it just can't do certain things. And other things, it just does them very poorly, just by the way it's designed. Now, it does a lot well, and if you focus on the strengths of the system, you'll have a great game. You know, I've run Pathfinder before, and I'll run it again. But you've got to find the right tool for the right job. So my current game, for example, I'm using the Song of Ice and Fire system because it does some things better than Pathfinder. It does other things not as well as Pathfinder. But for this game, what I needed was some mass combat rules and some organization rules to build noble houses. And that's what Song of Ice and Fire has. In Pathfinder, the mass combat rules are not strong. There's no organizational rules that I've seen that I was happy with. Also, you lose a lot of, I mean, there are other things you could contrast against the two as well. I've done video reviews for both systems. Watch the videos back to back, and you'll see all the differences. Probably. Or better yet, just buy the books yourself. Especially Song of Ice and Fire. To support the company that's already gone bankrupt, I think. It was very sad. But back to my point, I totally agree with you, Robert. Switch it up, change it up. For myself, I will run one game that's fantasy style, and then my next game is going to be any other genre, and then I come back to fantasy the following year or the following game. So, for example, I ran Legends of the Seven Sands. That was fantasy. It was Egyptian, Arabian themed. Then for our next campaign, brought in Solar Wars, space opera game. And then unfortunately that did not last as long as it should have, could have. So we came back to fantasy, and now we're doing Return of the Rune Fangs. You can check out my video recaps right here on this channel. And then for my next game, it's not going to be fantasy. It'll be anything but fantasy. It'll probably either be Solar Wars, done the way I originally wanted it to complete that storyline, or I'm strongly tempted to plug in a superhero game because it's such a challenging genre, and there's so much potential in it and it's just kind of like a really tempting target for me. Like, it's so hard to do well that I want to give it a shot. You can see my video on superhero games where I discuss some of those specific challenges. But that's what we do, and we specifically to not get this kind of fantasy fatigue that Robert's talking about. So, Robert, I hope that your group comes around and explores all of the different possibilities and worlds in role-playing games that don't involve medieval Europe or anything that resembles medieval Europe. I'm going to sign out now, and I wish you all good night and good gaming.